The Fairmont Grand Hotel, perched regally on the edge of Washington's historic district, shimmered that evening under a veil of golden twilight. Marble columns caught the dying sun's last embrace, and the tall glass doors rotated with a soft rhythm, ushering in waves of polished guests cloaked in luxury and importance. Inside, the ballroom unfolded like a living dream. Towering ceilings adorned with opulent chandeliers spilled glittering light across a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. The air was perfumed with the scent of fresh orchids, expensive cologne, and the anticipation of something worth remembering. It was the night of the annual Hearts of Tomorrow Gala, a star-studded charity event organized to support underprivileged youth through educational scholarships. Politicians, CEOs, actors, and philanthropists mingled beneath the carved gold cornices, their laughter bouncing from one mirrored wall to another. Beneath the surface of cordial greetings and champagne toasts, the night pulsed with competitive charm. Each guest quietly aware that to be seen, heard, and remembered here was to reaffirm one's place in the tapestry of power. Seated quietly near the edge of the ballroom, away from the epicenter of conversation and clinking glasses, was Barron Trump. Though he had just turned 18, he carried the composure of someone twice his age. Towering above most in stature, yet humble in posture, he occupied his chair with a quiet, deliberate presence. He wasn't adorned in extravagant designer labels like many of the attendees. Instead, he wore a finely tailored black suit, modest and elegant, without the need to demand attention. His eyes, cool, observant, and deeply aware, floated calmly across the crowd, not seeking but noticing. He had not come to be recognized. In fact, he had only accepted the invitation after the persistent encouragement of a family friend, who believed the event would offer him a chance to quietly re-enter public life on his own terms. Since leaving the White House, Barron had grown into a figure both curious and elusive, a name known to all, yet a soul known to none. His adolescence had unfolded beneath the blinding eye of a country divided, but tonight, he was not here as the son of a president. He was simply a guest in a vast room of stories, content to be a spectator. The gala had begun smoothly. A quartet played a lilting classical arrangement that softened the formal energy. Waiters moved like silk shadows between tables, balancing polished trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes. Gentle conversation filled the air like a warm mist. The evening's keynote speaker, a well-known liberal journalist renowned for their unapologetic candor, was the final event before the evening turned to pledges and performances. Their name was spoken with equal parts admiration and trepidation, depending on whom you asked. As the MC tapped the microphone and began to introduce the speaker, a subtle shift rippled through the room. Conversations ceased. Napkins were set down, glasses tilted but not sipped. All eyes turned to the stage, including Barron's. The journalist emerged with theatrical confidence, their posture proud and gestures fluid, wearing a tailored black suit that gleamed under the stage lights. Their smile was sharp, honed by years of experience both behind a camera and at the center of cultural storms. They opened with humor, charming the room with light jokes about traffic, hotel staff, and the unpredictability of Gala's past. The laughter they earned was genuine at first, warm and easing. But beneath their charisma was a familiar tension, a razor carefully sheathed in silk. And before long, the transition began. What had started as benign cultural observations gradually morphed into sharper commentary. Political barbs found their way into the cadence of the speech, cleverly veiled at first, then more direct. It was expected. They were known for pushing boundaries. The room, although seasoned in polite society, began to shift in tone. Laughter grew hesitant. Glances darted toward tables where political figures sat. Some smiled tightly. Others simply stopped smiling at all. And then, as if tugging at the final thread of restraint, the journalist turned toward the family that had long been both lightning rod and legend. They began with a joke about Donald Trump, his hair, his tweets, his iconic unpredictability. The punchlines were rehearsed, the audience's reactions predictable, polite laughter, a few chuckles too loud, and a sprinkling of awkward glances. But then came a moment no one was expecting. And of course, the journalist said with a casual smirk, "We can't forget about the most overlooked legacy. What it's like growing up in a golden tower while the rest of us are just trying to survive Monday mornings." They paused, letting the crowd process the implication. Imagine, they continued, being Barron Trump. Your dad's tweeting about Kofefi, the world's unraveling, and you're trying to figure out algebra in a room bigger than most people's homes. That must be character building. A few people chuckled, unsure if they should. A few winced, definitely sure they shouldn't. And at that moment, all eyes drifted instinctively toward the back of the ballroom, where Barron Trump sat. He hadn't moved, not a flinch. His hands remained gently folded in his lap. His posture had not shifted, his gaze hadn't wavered. The light fell on him just so, catching the faint glint of a cufflink. There was no fury in his eyes, no discomfort, just a quiet stillness that demanded nothing, yet commanded everything. The silence in the room deepened, not because the words had been too sharp, but because his reaction was sharper. He did not offer the journalist the satisfaction of discomfort, nor the defense of anger. His stillness became louder than the words that had provoked it. The mockery, however cleverly delivered, began to echo with a hollow clang in the marble vaults of that grand ballroom. The journalist cleared their throat, suddenly aware of the shift in mood, but pressed on awkwardly, their usual rhythm now uneven. The crowd had lost its appetite for jest. Barron remained seated. His expression, unreadable yet unyielding, had become the moral axis around which the evening now rotated. That single moment, an 18-year-old boy absorbing public ridicule with poise beyond his years, held more gravity than 1,000 standing ovations. And though no words escaped his lips, the message was unmistakable. You may speak, but you cannot shake me. The gala was no longer about the speech. It had become about the silence that followed it, and the young man who had transformed it into a lesson in grace. As the final words of the speech dissolved into the ballroom's quiet tension, an invisible weight seemed to settle over the crowd. The journalist, momentarily thrown off course, attempted to regain momentum, peppering in a few final thoughts about youth, privilege, and accountability. Yet none of it landed as it should have, not after the line they had just crossed. The carefully constructed laughter that once danced along the edges of the room now drifted like smoke, thin and unsatisfying. Barron Trump remained seated, his gaze fixed ahead, his breathing even and unhurried. He didn't glance around to gauge reactions, nor did he shift to adjust his posture. It was as though he had rehearsed this moment in silence, as though he had expected it all along. But there was no bitterness on his face, no trace of the anger so many would have understood. Instead, there was a stillness, serene and striking, that seemed to wrap around his tall frame like armor forged from years of endurance. Around him, the room pulsed with unspoken questions. Some guests turned to their neighbors, eyebrows raised, mouths slightly parted as though unsure whether to say anything at all. Others looked down at their place settings, fidgeting with silverware or adjusting the folds of their napkins. Anything to avoid locking eyes with the young man who had just become the silent centerpiece of the evening. Waitstaff moved a little more slowly, their trays suddenly heavier, as if even the clinking of cutlery might shatter the fragile air that now hovered above the tables. The MC, sensing the shift with the intuition of someone who had seen too many nights derail too quickly, stepped back to the microphone and offered a thin smile. With practiced ease, he thanked the speaker for their thought-provoking reflections and swiftly transitioned the room into the next phase of the evening, the charity auction. Yet even his voice, usually smooth and commanding, wavered slightly at the edges. Barron took a sip from the glass of water beside him, the motion deliberate, almost meditative. He set the glass back down, never letting his gaze waver, never letting his expression betray the slightest change. It was not a performance. It was composure, practiced and real, the kind born not from media coaching or political grooming, but from years of navigating a world that had already decided who he was long before he had a chance to speak for himself. A woman seated at the next table, a philanthropist known for her work in youth mentorship, watched Barron with eyes that had softened noticeably. She had laughed at the earlier jokes, perhaps even smirked at the mention of privilege. But now she saw something else. The image of a boy, grown into a young man, surrounded by whispers and judgment, holding steady while the storm swirled around him. And in that image, she saw something she hadn't expected to find: grace. As the auction began, voices slowly returned to the room, yet the previous energy never truly reappeared. Paddles were raised, bids were called, and applause returned in scattered bursts. But through it all, the atmosphere had shifted. Something had changed, though no one quite knew how to name it. It was as if the room had been reminded of something often forgotten in political discourse: that public figures, especially their children, are human too. Barron, still seated, still silent, eventually rose from his chair. His movement was calm, unhurried, yet it drew more attention than the stage had all night. He excused himself from the table with a quiet nod to the host who had invited him. No dramatics, no spectacle, just a quiet, graceful departure. Heads turned to follow him as he walked toward the exit, but not one person called his name. No one reached for a photo or attempted to stop him. Perhaps they understood, in that moment, that there are silences which speak louder than sound. As he stepped into the hallway, the heavy double doors of the ballroom closed behind him with a soft but final click. The corridor was cool and empty, its lights dimmed to a warm amber glow. His footsteps echoed gently against the marble floor, each one steady and unbroken. The tension of the evening clung to his shoulders like mist, but he did not shake it off. He carried it as he always had, with a kind of quiet pride that asked for no sympathy, only respect. He paused near a tall window overlooking the city skyline, the glittering lights stretching like constellations across the black velvet of night. For a moment, he stood still, his hands tucked gently in his pockets, watching the slow crawl of traffic below. He breathed deeply, not to calm himself, but to feel the air again, to center himself in a world that often refused to see him as anything other than a surname. Behind him, faint music began drifting through the closed doors, an orchestra playing the first notes of a waltz. But here, outside the echo chamber of opinion and applause, it was quiet. It was honest. And for the first time that evening, Barron allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. He had not come to impress anyone. He had not come to defend his family, nor to confront his critics. He had come simply to listen and observe. But what he left behind in that ballroom was a silent lesson in poise, a ripple of introspection that would stay with each guest far longer than any speech or toast. The journalist, still on stage, glanced toward the empty chair where Barron had been. They cleared their throat and forced a final joke to round off the segment, but it landed flat. The laughter was thin, hollow, a shadow of what it had been earlier. Something about the silence they had provoked had changed the room. And somewhere in the back of their mind, they knew, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that words have limits, especially when confronted by the strength of quiet dignity. Barron continued walking down the hallway, each step echoing with calm certainty. He did not look back. There was no need. The message had already been sent. Long after Barron Trump had exited the ballroom, the atmosphere within remained suspended in a strange stillness, as if the oxygen itself had grown reflective. Conversations resumed eventually, but there was a noticeable restraint, as though everyone had collectively agreed to speak a little softer, move a little slower, and think a little deeper. The jokes that had once drawn hearty laughter now seemed out of place, like forgotten relics of a less thoughtful moment. The journalist, now seated again at their table, appeared visibly distant. The pride that once animated their every expression had faded into something quieter, something that teetered between doubt and discomfort. They nursed a glass of wine without sipping, their eyes fixed on the flickering candle in front of them. Around them, conversations continued in cautious tones, and the clinking of forks against china seemed louder than ever. Across the room, people whispered, not with scandal or ridicule, but with genuine curiosity and unease. No one could deny the impact of what had transpired. It wasn't merely that a joke had landed poorly. It was that a young man had absorbed a public blow without flinching, and in doing so, had revealed the fragility of those who believed words were always theirs to command. Something about the quiet strength in Barron's demeanor had unsettled the very foundation of the evening's tone. One guest, an elderly woman in a silver gown embroidered with sequins, leaned over to her husband and murmured something thoughtful. She had raised 3 sons herself, and had spent a lifetime watching them navigate their identities in a world that demanded more than it ever gave. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. He's not a boy anymore. In a corner near the exit, a political commentator known for his biting wit stood staring at the door through which Barron had departed. His usual smirk had softened into something more contemplative. He had been among those who chuckled at the earlier jokes, not maliciously, but reflexively. Now, however, the moment haunted him. He realized, perhaps too late, that witnessing quiet dignity was far more powerful than dismantling an idea with clever phrasing. Barron, meanwhile, had already stepped outside into the cool Washington night, where the hum of distant traffic merged with the rhythmic chirping of crickets. The black car waiting at the curb gleamed under the streetlights, its tinted windows hiding the faint outline of the driver waiting patiently inside. Yet Barron didn't climb in right away. Instead, he walked past the vehicle, his footsteps echoing against the pavement, drawn toward the small reflecting pool tucked behind the hotel's garden terrace. The water's surface shimmered gently under the moonlight, disturbed only by the occasional breeze that whispered through the manicured hedges. Barron stood at its edge, gazing down at the moving reflection of the sky above. The city lights flickered in the distance, a quiet reminder of the ever-watching world from which he had momentarily stepped away. He didn't reach for his phone or scroll through headlines to see how the moment was playing online. He didn't call anyone to explain or deconstruct what had happened. He simply stood in silence, letting the stillness of the night wrap around him like a trusted companion. There was no need for validation, no craving for applause. The moment had spoken for itself. From a distance, a hotel staff member stepped outside, his jacket hanging loosely over one arm. He paused briefly upon recognizing Barron, but said nothing, sensing the sanctity of the quiet that enveloped him. Respectfully, he turned and walked in the opposite direction, granting Barron the solitude that so few ever offered him. As Barron stood by the water's edge, a memory floated into his mind, one from a simpler time, when the noise of the world had not yet demanded so much of him. He remembered walking through Central Park with his mother, leaves crunching beneath their feet, her voice low and gentle as she pointed out a bird's nest hidden in the branches. "Stillness," she had said, "reveals things the wind cannot show." He had never quite understood it then, but tonight it echoed with meaning. Behind him, the Gala continued, its grandeur intact, its chandeliers still casting their golden spell upon the guests. But its soul had shifted. In a room full of influence and ego, it had taken a young man's silence to remind them what true character looked like. And though he had not offered a single rebuttal or spoken a word in response to the ridicule, he had managed to say more than any speech could have. Somewhere near the hotel entrance, a reporter stepped outside and typed a short message into their phone. They had watched the entire scene unfold from a nearby table and were struck not by the drama of it, but by the absence of it. They composed a single sentence before hitting send. Barron Trump just taught the room a lesson no microphone could amplify. Inside the ballroom, a soft murmur spread as guests passed word of his departure. Not with gossip, but with a kind of reverent acknowledgement. The young man who had arrived quietly, hoping to observe, had somehow become the mirror in which they were all forced to see themselves. In another corner of the city, a trending hashtag began to emerge. It wasn't fueled by outrage or satire, but by awe. Hashtag Stillness Speaks. There were no official statements, no press releases. Just one moment, captured in 100 quiet ways, resonating far beyond the walls of the hotel. And as Barron finally turned away from the water, stepping back toward the waiting car, He did so without hurry. He had not changed the world in one evening, but he had changed something just as meaningful. He had reminded those watching that strength is not always loud, and silence is not always weakness. He reached the vehicle, opened the door, and settled into the seat. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, waiting for direction. Barron simply nodded. The car eased into motion, gliding gently into the night, carrying with it a message that would echo far longer than anyone expected. By the time dawn stretched its golden fingers across the horizon, the city had already begun to stir from its slumber. Washington's skyline, cloaked in shades of dusty rose and amber, slowly blinked to life beneath the early morning haze. Streetlights dimmed as shopkeepers unlocked doors, joggers laced their shoes, and a new day stepped quietly into the light. Inside a modest Georgetown brownstone tucked behind a veil of ivy, Barron Trump sat by a window with a warm mug cradled gently between his palms. He hadn't slept much, but the weight on his shoulders didn't feel heavy, only quiet. The world outside buzzed softly with movement, yet within these walls, there was peace, a silence undisturbed by cameras, headlines, or whispered judgments. He liked it that way. The events of the previous evening were not distant in his memory, but they did not play on a loop or scream for attention. Instead, they rested in the background of his mind, like distant church bells, soft, steady, and certain. He did not need to rehash them, nor did he seek to rewrite them. What had been said had been said. What had been felt had been felt. What had remained unspoken had already changed everything. On the sleek table beside him sat a stack of newspapers, untouched and unopened, though he knew what they likely contained. The story, or rather the silence, had made its way across the city like a whisper passed from one thoughtful soul to another. Yet Barron did not reach for the headlines. He had never been particularly interested in how others chose to interpret his actions. What mattered to him was simpler and far less visible: a calm heart, a clear conscience, and a life that felt like his own, even if just in fleeting moments. Downstairs, the front door creaked softly as a courier delivered a padded envelope addressed in delicate script. Barron's assistant, an older gentleman with a scholarly demeanor, retrieved it without a word, then climbed the staircase and placed it gently beside Barron's untouched breakfast. Barron glanced at it, but made no immediate move to open it. There was a serenity in waiting, in letting the day unfold without force. Elsewhere in the city, conversations were blooming like early spring flowers, tentative, unsure, but undeniably present. At breakfast tables and coffee counters, people who had attended the gala the night before shared stories not about celebrities or grand speeches, but about stillness. They spoke of the boy who had sat in silence, the young man who had not risen to defend himself, yet had somehow inspired everyone else to rethink their tone, their assumptions, their sharpness. In one particular newsroom, the journalist who had delivered the ill-fated remarks sat at their desk, bathed in the sterile light of computer screens and the hum of fluorescent overheads. They stared at a blank document, their fingers resting on the keyboard like reluctant guests at a table they didn't want to leave. Every word they considered felt too rehearsed, too hollow, too late. There was nothing clever left to say. Eventually, they typed something they hadn't expected, a private letter addressed to Barron himself. No editor would ever read it. No publication would ever print it. But it felt necessary, not as an apology meant to erase the moment, but as a gesture born from reflection. A quiet offering to the silence that had been louder than their voice. And far from the capital's corridors of power, in a small town in Pennsylvania, a high school student watched a grainy video from the gala that had surfaced online. It wasn't professionally edited. The lighting was poor, the angle off-center, and the sound barely clear. But it captured the moment after the joke, the silence, the shift in the room, the stillness of one young man who didn't flinch. The student watched it twice, then 3 times, and eventually sent it to a friend with just 2 words: real strength. Barron, still seated by the window, finally reached for the envelope. Inside, he found a handwritten note and a small photograph. The note came from a woman he had never met, one of the guests from the gala, who had quietly watched the moment unfold. Her words were simple but precise, full of gratitude, admiration, and something more rare: humility. She wrote of her own assumptions, the ease with which she had laughed at the opening jokes, and the quiet shame that followed. She confessed that she had come expecting politics and pageantry, but had instead encountered something entirely different: a mirror, one that forced her to see not just who he was, but who she had become. And then, the final line, penned with the tremor of emotion: "Thank you for showing us what restraint can reveal, and what dignity, when left unshaken, can teach us all." Barron read the note slowly, carefully, then placed it back in the envelope. He looked out the window again, the rising sun now casting warm light across the neighboring rooftops. The city was fully awake now, but it was quieter than usual, less urgent, more reflective, as if even the rhythm of daily life had paused to absorb something it could not yet name. He rose from the chair, setting the mug down gently. There was much to do today, but none of it called to him with urgency. He would move through it, as he had always done, with calm purpose and careful steps. Not because he sought recognition, and not because he felt misunderstood, but because he had discovered a truth many still hadn't. That true strength was not forged in the fire of loud resistance, but in the gentle steadiness of choosing peace when provoked, of choosing silence when silence says more than any defense ever could. He walked from the room, the envelope tucked under his arm, the morning light framing his figure like a quiet benediction. The world outside was loud, but inside him it was still. Several days had passed since the gala, yet the ripples created by that one quiet moment continued to drift outward, slow but unstoppable. Across digital platforms and television panels, pundits and commentators struggled to analyze an event that hadn't followed any known script, an exchange that had not unfolded through verbal sparring, dramatic confrontation, or grand gestures, but through a kind of noble stillness that defied conventional understanding. There were no angry responses issued from Barron Trump's camp, no press releases carefully worded by PR strategists, no carefully edited videos posted in defense or retaliation. In a world addicted to noise and reaction, his silence stood like a lighthouse in a storm, unmoving, dignified, and impossible to ignore. For days, talk shows ran segments with titles like "The Power of Composure" and "What Barron Didn't Say Speaks Loudest of All." Editors at major publications scrambled to find writers who could distill the essence of a moment that had not been designed for attention, yet had captured the attention of an entire nation. But beyond the headlines and commentary, something more subtle and meaningful had begun to unfold. It wasn't about public image or political sides. It was about reflection. People in quiet corners of their lives found themselves asking questions they hadn't asked in a long time. How often do I speak when I should listen? How often do I choose mockery instead of understanding? When was the last time I respected someone's silence as strength rather than mistaking it for weakness? Inside classrooms and boardrooms, living rooms and cafes, the story was retold not as a political anecdote, but as a parable about restraint. Parents shared it with their children, not to celebrate a name, but to highlight a principle. Teachers referenced it in discussions on character. And in church pews and quiet prayer circles, the phrase, "a gentle answer turns away wrath," found renewed meaning. Barron himself remained detached from the storm that had followed. He had resumed his studies, walked the quiet streets near his Georgetown apartment, and written more frequently in the journal he kept hidden in the back of his desk drawer. He did not need to speak about that night. What had needed to be said had been spoken already, without sound, without protest, without anger. One morning, just after sunrise, Barron received a small package wrapped in brown paper, its edges frayed and softened by time. No sender was listed. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was an old leather-bound book of meditations, well-worn, with notes scribbled in the margins and a faded inscription on the first page that read simply, "For the one who chooses stillness over fury." Beneath the book lay a single piece of stationery, its handwriting rough and uneven, but honest. "I was in that ballroom. I laughed. I thought I was clever. I saw you and I was ashamed. You reminded me of the son I used to be proud of before anger hardened his voice. Thank you for teaching me without saying a word. Barron held the letter for several minutes, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, not from emotion, but from the fragile humanity it carried. It wasn't about praise. It wasn't about vindication. It was a reminder that even in a world addicted to applause, the quietest moments often carry the deepest echoes. Later that week, an invitation arrived from a local school asking him to speak. Not as a political figure, but as a young man who had inspired students to reconsider the value of dignity. He declined the request with kindness, not because he was uninterested, but because he believed the message was not about him. It was about the lesson itself, and he had already delivered it. That same evening, he took a walk along the Potomac River, the city's lights shimmering on the surface like fireflies caught in glass. The cool air wrapped around him, not unkindly, and the world felt wide yet peaceful. He paused at a stone bench overlooking the water, letting the rhythmic sound of the current settle into his chest like a slow heartbeat. He thought about legacy, not the kind measured in headlines or institutions, but the quiet trail a person leaves behind in the hearts they touch. Perhaps strength wasn't about how loudly one speaks, but about the courage to remain unmoved when the world demands reaction. Perhaps it was about patience, about listening before speaking, about standing still while others stumble in search of power. He would never be the kind of leader who shouted over others or fought to win every debate. He had no interest in performing for applause. But he now understood something far deeper than influence or perception, that to choose self-control over retaliation was to choose growth, to choose presence, to choose peace. As the wind carried the faint scent of cherry blossoms from across the water, Barron stood from the bench and turned back toward the path. His footsteps were slow but steady, his breath calm, and his shoulders relaxed. He walked not with urgency, but with quiet conviction, knowing that strength, real strength, was not born in battle, but in the moments we refuse to become what the world expects us to be. He did not need to correct anyone. He did not need to be louder. The silence he had given the world was still speaking, still rippling, still changing the very air around those who had once believed that mockery could define a person's worth. And somewhere, in homes, in classrooms, in hearts that had once rushed to judge, people were learning, slowly and surely, what it meant to be dignified. Not because Barron Trump had said something brilliant, but because, in the face of mockery, he had said nothing at all.